He understood the country. He understood the principles on which it was based. He believed in the United States, and he contributed that feeling of deep confidence in the American system to a degree that no one else that I've ever worked with could contribute.
He was two entirely different personalities. When he was chief of staff in his office, seeing people making decisions, he was cold and stern and aloof. But the minute you got off with him on a trip, he was the most relaxed, interesting person.
And one of my jobs was to persuade him that if he didn't set the story correct, and if he didn't suggest some things that other people would overlook or that I would overlook, his story wouldn't be told.
Production of George C. Marshall, A Personal Perspective, is funded in part by the George C. Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia. The Marshall Foundation is dedicated to preserving and promoting in American society the ideals and values of George C. Marshall.
Paul Nitze, former special advisor to the President and the Secretary of State, Merrill Pascoe, General George Marshall's secretary at the end of World War II, and Dr. Forrest Pogue, Marshall's official biographer, offer a personal perspective on the man that political and military leaders still turn to for inspiration. Ambassador Nitze, let me start with you. You've dealt firsthand with leaders throughout the past several decades. Was there anything about General Marshall's leadership qualities that set him apart, in your mind, from all the leaders you've met and dealt with?
Indeed, I thought that General Marshall was unique from my standpoint in his deep understanding of the U.S. form of democracy. He understood the country. He understood the principles on which it was based. He believed in the United States, and he contributed that feeling of deep confidence in the American system to a degree that no one else that I've ever worked with could contribute.
Even during the last 40 years, he stands apart.
To my mind, he stands apart.
Mr. Pascoe, did you see evidence of that kind of leadership working in that outer office as an aide, as the assistant to Marshall's secretary?
I certainly did. He had a perception of how our government operated. He had the greatest respect for Colonel Stimson, who was the Secretary of War and the civilian head of the War Department. He showed him the greatest respect and revered his position. When he dealt with Congress, he made it quite plain that he understood that Congress had control over the appropriations, and it was their business to be persuaded to do what should be done. He had a capacity for persuading people to do what ought to be done in a most unique way. He was a very intensely interested in the conservation of time and energy. He said he had very little of either, and he did not want to waste them. He was in his late 50s when he took on the great job of Chief of Staff to mobilize our Army, and his great emphasis was on saving energy and saving time.
On the surface, though, that makes him sound almost robot-like, very efficient. Dr. Pogue, when you interviewed General Marshall in the 50s, did you find a softer side to this man?
Not at first, because we were trying to get through a great deal of material in a short time. He wasn't sure that he wanted to spend that much time on it. He wasn't sure that his career was worth that much concentration. And so he attempted to go through a number of years of his career in a fairly short while. And one of my jobs was to persuade him that if he didn't set the story correct, and if he didn't suggest some things that other people would overlook or that I would overlook, his story wouldn't be told. He kept saying, I'll leave that to history. And I said, that's what I'm trying to represent. This is what I'm trying to do with this biography. And I did see this side of him, of wanting to save time, but it wasn't a robotic thing at all. It was just a philosophy that he worked out under pressure. I think that as a younger man, He's been quite full of an interest in life and enjoyed, you might say, wasting time, or at least concentrating on something besides getting the man in the office, in his office and out in the maximum time. It's quite a mistake, I believe, to try to base a judgment on the way he tended to work over a long period of his life on the basis of how he operated during the height of the war or in the midst of great problems as Secretary of State and as Secretary of Defense.
Ambassador Nitze, what was life like during those days in Washington when there was so much to be done? It boggles the mind. The world crisis, the World War II coming, going, then rebuilding Europe. What kind of people were there at the head of all this work?
Well, I look upon those days as being the days of the greatest opportunity that any human being could possibly have. We had the best leadership at the top of the state. We had President Truman, and then he was very much of the mind to follow the advice of Dean Acheson and General Marshall. They in turn believed in delegating things to their subordinates and encouraging their subordinates to act on their own. The line of policy was clear. It was just a joy and an opportunity to do all kinds of things, and we were encouraged to so do by our superiors, and you can't imagine a better life than that.
How did General Marshall convince people that he could be trusted with these great responsibilities? What was it about him that allowed him to do that?
Well, first of all, it was his belief and confidence and understanding of the American system and the Congress and the people and what you had to do in order to get the people to understand and come along with what he was trying to do and how you could educate them. He was also somewhat of a showman. He really understood how to make dramatize what it was he wanted to do. I remember when Chip Bolden and I were asked by him to prepare a statement for him before the Republican-controlled Armed Services and Appropriations Committee. And we worked all night on preparing this document. And in the morning, we appeared in his office, and he read this. And he said, well, I don't think I'll use this. And Chip and I were shocked by that. And he said, now, wait a minute. I will read this and study it over the weekend, and I will know it all. I will have studied it carefully. What is it you think that committee is interested in? You think they're interested in your ideas? No. They're interested in whether I know anything about the Marshall Plan. Therefore, I will go to this hearing somewhat late. I will appear late, and I have a very good excuse as to why I'm appearing late. I will sit down, and then they will ask me for a prepared statement, and I will say, I have none. And that will shock them. Then they will begin to ask me questions, and I will then have mastered all the material you have given me, and then I will hold forth. No matter what questions they ask me, I can reproduce all this, and that will be effective. And in fact, it was. That committee, that very session, voted unanimously to support the Marshall Plan.
So it was all planned out in his mind, the scenario, the way it would work out.
It was indeed, and he told us about it in advance, and he executed it with brilliance and with true drama. It was a marvelous performance.
Did you get a sense of performance as you worked for Marshall?
Well, there's no question about it. He was two entirely different personalities. When he was chief of staff in his office, seeing people making decisions, he was cold and stern and aloof. But the minute you got off with him on a trip, he was the most relaxed, interesting person. He was almost garrulous in his method of conversation, telling hunting stories, telling stories of times in China. He was just and he had great interest in his family, and he conducted extensive correspondence with several godchildren. He was just the most normal human being that you could imagine when he was not in his official capacity. On the other hand, I have seen him be absolutely ruthless. He went down to Fort Jackson early in the war to review 3 of the National Guard divisions, and it was perfectly apparent when we got there that the division commanders were not physically capable of leading these divisions, and he relieved a corps commander and 2 division commanders in one afternoon. And flying back to Washington, he said, "This is the toughest part of this job." He said, "One of those generals that I relieved lost a son only a month ago." He said, "I could not let that interfere with my decision to do the right thing for the Army."
There was a clear division in his mind, a sense of duty to what was right, to the country, to his
That's
service.
Right. That's right.
And he divided that from
Yeah.
personal feelings.
That's right. I think we must not overlook the marvelous relationship he had with his wife, his second wife, Ms. Marshall, to whom he was married from 1937 on. Everybody in the War Department had lunch at the Secretary of War's mess except General Marshall. He went back to Fort Myer every day to have lunch with Mrs. Marshall. He found it a relaxing thing. He was devoted to her. They had a marvelous relationship. And he was devoted to her children. And when her son was killed at Anzio, it was one of the greatest blows that I saw the general sustain. He was just a real family man, a real normal human being when he was not posturing as chief of staff and running the Army.